All right, very good. And I'll turn it over to our presenters, David and Julie.
Great. Let us just share the screen here so you can see the presentation. Perfect. Everyone see that okay? Excellent. Thank you so much. So as I said, I'm David Thomson. I'm the Executive Director of Employers Against Domestic Violence, and I am here with Julie DeCosta, who is a longtime board member for EADV and a Senior Director of Human Resources at MercurySystems. Julie's had lots of experience working with victims in the workplace, so her expertise is going to be really helpful in today's presentation. And I just wanted to start off by talking about the mission of Employers Against Domestic Violence, which is to build collaborative partnerships to address the issues of domestic violence by developing and disseminating resources and models for prevention, education, and outreach. Our ultimate goal is to create more productive workplaces that are intolerant of domestic violence and are safe and supportive for victims of domestic violence. So our presentation today is domestic violence is everyone's business, and what we're trying to offer is practical steps employers can take to protect your business and your employees. If you have any questions at all during today's presentation, please just unmute and ask your question. You can put your hand up, you can put something in the chat. Sam, hopefully you can monitor the chat, so that'd be great. We have a very small group this morning, so happy to make this as interactive as possible. And we're going to start the interaction right away.
Yeah.
There we go.
Yeah. So good morning, everyone. Thanks for having us. As David said, we'd like it to be a little interactive. So I'll start off with a question, which is, what is domestic violence? Can anyone shout out or write in the chat, their ideas of what domestic violence is?
What comes to mind when you hear the words domestic violence? And we're lucky we have an expert on the Zoom with us, with Ashley here from Hawk. They work with victims every day, so providing the direct services. That's not what we do at Employers Against Domestic Violence. We educate employers about the issue, make them aware of the issue, some of the signs, how they can help employers. But when we get someone that comes to us and says, I need help with exit planning, I need help with, how I can stay in my home with my abuser, all of those things, we then direct them to the local Jane Doe organization. And in this area, it would be Hawk.
So Glennis put in the chat, abusive behavior, both verbally, physically, and emotionally.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Any other thoughts or ideas?
Maybe it could be like a bully in the neighborhood, that people are walking around their neighborhood and they feel threatened by
Okay.
somebody.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Anyone else? All right, well, let's give you the actual definition. So domestic violence is a pattern of one person trying to dominate or control another person, and it involves different types of abuse, which we'll talk about in 1 second here. It's a repetitive process to the whole issue of bullying as well. If any of you have kids in school that go through anti-bullying programs, they talk about that being a repetitive process. It's not a one-time event, although one time is not acceptable. It is a process where the perpetrator gets hold of the victim in a consistent manner and comes in many of these forms. So physical abuse, when you think about that, it's kind of the obvious. It's the pushing, kicking, strangling, those types of things. Sexual abuse, forced sex, rape, sexual threats, things like that. Emotional abuse, threats, manipulations, lies, name calling, things like that. Psychological abuse is degradation, manipulation, name calling, bullying, verbal abuse, extreme criticisms or comparisons, how come you're not as pretty as so-and-so? How come you're not as smart as so-and-so? Those types of things. And then economic abuse is a huge one. It's denying access to bank accounts and financial platforms. It could be potentially giving the person being abused an allowance, and they're only allowed to spend X amount during the week or during the month, and every dollar needs to be accounted for. It's all about control. So let's look at some stats in the United States. It is the single leading cause of injury to women in the US. It accounts for more injuries and deaths than auto accidents, muggings, and rapes combined. 6 million women in the US are beaten each year by their partners. And from a workforce perspective, and when you think about healthcare costs, each year domestic violence results in nearly 100,000 days of hospitalization, 30,000 emergency room visits, and 40,000 physician visits. These are huge numbers, and you can see here on the screen, 92% of women or girls are killed by a man they knew or know, and 63% are killed by their current or former husbands or current boyfriends. Yeah, the numbers are staggering, and unfortunately they get more staggering as we go here. Because 1 in 3 women and 1 in 7 men have been or will be victims of domestic violence in their lifetime. You see different statistics out there all the time. Some say, 1 in 4 women, or 1 in 4 men, 1 in 10 men. It's, but these are the latest statistics from the CDC, which are staggering when you think about that. 1 in 3 women. And I should have said at the beginning of this presentation that when we talk about domestic violence, we talk about it more as the woman being a victim or a survivor, simply because it affects them more. 1 in 3 women versus 1 in 7 men, but we can't ignore the fact that this happens to men, whether it's men in a same-sex relationship, whether it's men being abused by a woman. There's so many different, factors in play here, but we typically talk about it in terms of women when we talk about the victims and survivors. So you think of these numbers, right? 1 in 3, it's a huge number, but it's also kind of, a number that's, hard to put your head around, at least it is for me. So what we like to do in these presentations is localize it. So we got some local information from a couple local businesses. First one being Beauport Hospitality Group. And these numbers from Beauport are very rough numbers, because they were trying to help me out on Friday afternoon while they were in the middle of a bunch of meetings trying to get numbers for me. So they have approximately 350 employees. 210 of them are female, 140 are male. So that means out of the 350 employees that work for Beauport Hospitality Group, 70 of them, again, statistically, it's not saying exact 70 at Beauport Hospitality Group, but statistically, 70 of those employees that are female are victims of domestic violence. 20 males that work for them are victims. I find these numbers really help to bring it home, to localize it. We were just talking before this started about, one of Beauport's properties right down the street at Seaport Grill. They have several properties here. They have a restaurant in town as well. I'm sure many of you have been to the hotel, have been to cruise port. So you probably know a lot of people that work there. And when you think about it that way, it brings it closer to home. Another example is Bank Gloucester. They have 60 employees, 45 are female, so they are very female skewed business. So that means, again, statistically, I'm not saying 15 people there or 15 women there, but statistically, 15 women that work at Bank Gloucester and 2 men have been or will be victims of domestic violence in their lifetime. So again, I find that it really helps to bring these numbers close to home. So let's talk about the effects on the victim first, and I'd like to open this up again Maybe you've had a little more coffee in the last few minutes and might want to share some thoughts on what you think being in a domestic violent relationship has on the victim. And again, feel free to shout out or put in the chat any thoughts you might have on what those effects are.
I guess I'll give it a shot. I was trying to give people space to talk and not be the, the teacher's pet and say every answer. But aside, I guess I'll talk about aside the psychological and physical effects that it can have. I'll talk about finance as it's, I think, a big topic today. But it can have one of the biggest barriers is to leave. It's like the financial means. It can cost someone their home. It can have them uproot their kids from their school district, having to move. Once survivors are in the weeds of the criminal justice system, it will affect their employment because they have to miss work in order to make it to courts or in order to go to hospital visits or therapy, whatever the case might be. So yeah, it will have a big impact in the finance department and attorney fees, etc.
And Cindy on Zoom said low self-esteem. Julie also, Julie Garrity from Hawk is also on Zoom. She said stress, loss of confidence.
Absolutely. Yep, those are all accurate. You know, so we just wrote down some of the effects, and there are more than this, but depression, difficulty concentrating, PTSD, anxiety, sadness, often leads to, not often, but it could lead to substance abuse. Low self-esteem is a big issue. Guilt, embarrassment, self-blame, lots of those types of things, and the things that you've mentioned. And Ashley also touched on some of the challenges as well. You know, those were the effects, you know, but then there are the challenges, which are the financial considerations, you know, isolation, that feeling of, you know, being alone and no one else is in this situation. And when you think of it, go back one slide to those 1 and 3 numbers, you know, you're not alone. Guilt, promises to change from the abuser, denial or minimization of the abuse, those types of things. Oftentimes it is wanting to keep the family together, fear of losing custody of children. Sometimes it's religious and cultural beliefs, inability to access or even know what support services are available. And sometimes it's just plain exhaustion, you know, that they're just trying to make it through the day. And so there are lots of challenges here. Okay, so a couple just things to remember before Julie takes over here is an independent source of income is the single most significant indicator that a woman will be able to permanently leave an abuser. They need to have financial security. And again, domestic violence is about control, and a woman's job is particular target for the abuser because it's both a perceived and an actual loss of control. It's a perceived loss of control because the abuser doesn't know what's happening while their victim is working. They don't know, you know, what is their coworker saying to them? What are they telling, you know, their coworkers? Those type of things. And it's an actual loss of control because they physically cannot see them. They can't be with them during that time.
And so we're going to focus on domestic violence in the workplace specifically in the next few sections of slides. 83% of women said that abusive partners hindered their ability to work, and 70% of those women said they were not able to even have jobs. 53% said they lost their jobs because of abuse. And so think of the effects of emotional abuse, or think of the effects of anxiety or PTSD. So when employees are at work, victims or survivors are at work, their concentration may be compromised, their performance for sure may be compromised. Workplace interruptions also might occur. So they could occur from the batterer. Think of someone trying to get their work done and has received 150 text messages in an hour from their batterer. Of course, their concentration would be affected in some way. Of course, they would be anxious or upset by something like that. Think also about how this productivity might affect their coworkers. So they might be sitting next to someone that they regularly work with, and the victim is upset or anxious or isn't able to concentrate, and the coworker observes this, or the coworker's performance is also impacted out of concern, out of wanting to help. And so this not only affects the victim at work, but it also affects coworkers. And so I want to dig in a little bit further, and I gave you an example of how this violence can impact on and off the work site. So we think of domestic violence in a home setting, and that's true primarily. However, the violence does flow into the workforce. Think of someone who works in a department, and the department is trying to meet their objectives, and they've asked employees to work overtime. And a victim is upset and concerned and wanting to participate in helping the department meet their objectives by working overtime. However, she knows that her time of when she goes to work and when she comes home is monitored by the batterer. Very often, her odometer on her car is inspected, knowing the batterer knowing that there's so many miles between home and work. And so those are some examples of how this can impact an employee both on and off the work site. It also interferes with an individual's capability to safely and securely perform their duties. Think about sleep deprivation and physical injuries. A victim may have come into work and some of her fingers have been broken. And so she's unable to type accurately. She's unable to use the computer accurately. And so that impacts her ability to perform the job safely. It also includes conduct which occurs outside of the workplace, yet it has an impact on the individual's ability to perform a job. I gave you an example of text messaging. Sometimes there's emails at that volume as well. 75% of convicted batterers admitted to using work resources to commit crimes of domestic violence, include stalking and threatening their partners. In reality, companies have an obligation to inspect and investigate use of company equipment for personal use. And oftentimes we found that companies just don't have the resources to investigate situations like that. 78% of the workplace resources at least once to express remorse or anger to check up on or threaten the victim. So batterers express remorse. They do that with the victim. I'm sorry, this will never happen again. They also do that when they use company equipment and say, you know, yes, I'm sorry, I should not have done that. I won't do that again. And think about attendance. Attendance from both batterer and the victim is often compromised. Hard to get to work on time because you were trying to cover up some bruises, or you're trying to get ready and be at work on time, and you're unable to because something has happened this morning to you or that previous evening. You haven't slept, and so you're exhausted and trying to do everything. From my perspective, what I'm concerned about as a human resources professional and working in businesses is the cost. The financial effects of domestic violence on the workplace. So we have some CDC numbers that report that domestic violence costs businesses $8.3 billion in expenses annually. $8.3 billion is hard for me to get my arms around. When you break that out a little bit further, David talked about the medical costs associated with domestic violence briefly. 5.8 of that $1 billion is associated with higher medical costs, and $2.5 billion is associated with lost productivity. So 61% of recently surveyed senior executives stated that domestic violence has a harmful effect on the company's productivity, and 70% said that domestic violence negatively affects attendance. I also want to talk about other kinds of costs that that we probably think about on the periphery. However, human costs, the loss of a human life, is a tragedy we see all too frequently in the news. We're seeing it now with someone in Gardner that is not even able to be found. And we see it so frequently that sometimes, we become immune to it. Lost productivity is something I talked about. 35% of all females in an emergency room are there because of domestic violence. Most employees get their health coverage through their employer. And so when you're in an emergency room and you look around and you think 35% of females here are here because of an issue regarding domestic violence. And then lastly, we think about the cost of turnover. So the cost to hire and train an employee is approximately 1 to 1.5 times, 1.5 to 2 times the salary of the position. I want to keep employees in their job. It costs a lot to train and have employees become proficient in their job. And so I want to keep employees there, keep employees productive, and keep employees safe. And oftentimes the turnover numbers are so great that we don't even realize that the turnover might be associated with a domestic violence issue. And so we have a quote here from an abuse survivor. Domestic violence made me late. It made me miss work. I was distracted and nervous all of the time because my husband kept calling and harassing me. And the bruises, they hurt so much that it affected my productivity. And so when I read that and when I think about that, it really inspires me to help those that need help in the workplace. And so we have some information to share next on responding to domestic violence in the workplace.
Yeah, we obviously, I think, have pretty conclusively shown this is an issue, right? And domestic violence is a workplace issue, but yet only 28% of US companies have policies addressing workplace violence. Yet it is the fastest growing motive for workplace homicides, according to the CDC. So I'm just going to run through 4 areas employers should consider when they are deciding how they're going to address domestic violence in the workplace. And the first is a corporate commitment. It has to come from the top. Your leadership must be invested or this is not going to work. And the 3 things they need to say are, we're not going to let it happen here. We will respond if it does. And if it does, we are here to help. You really need to make sure that that message is loud and clear. And again, it comes from the top and trickles down throughout the entire organization. If companies do that and they do it right, victims will come forward. It cannot be seen as a marketing activity. You really can't just talk about it. You need to walk the talk. Those are critical components. If you are going to do it, then you want to develop a response team. And these response teams are going to vary depending on the size of the organization and what you have available. You might not use each team member here for every incident, but you need to have a coordinated team in place. So you'd want someone from administration, whether that be most likely your HR department, or if you're super small, someone, that your manager of your company. Security or loss prevention needs to be involved. They might need to help with safety planning. If you don't have security, make sure you have a good relationship with your local police. Partner with them before you have an incident. invite them into your building, let them know who you are, what you do, all of those types of things, because that's going to make a difference. Should you have an incident, they're going to be prepared to help you. Public relations, you need to know what you can and can't say. And that's where the legal department comes in as well. And again, if you don't have a PR department or a legal department, you look at maybe external resources that you could bring in advance to have, so they have knowledge of your business and your organization prior to any incidents happening. And hopefully you'll never, ever have to use them. But, you know, based on the numbers, there's a high likelihood that you would. Some companies have employee assistance programs that are referral numbers that they can call and get help. But again, smaller numbers, smaller companies with a small number of employees won't have an EAP, but you do have organizations like Hawk. So if you don't have an EAP, call Hawk, learn more about them, find out what those resources are. They are there to help. And then if you're a union representative, our union shop, you'd want to make sure you have a union rep in there as well. So the third out of these 4 steps is you've got this workplace, you know, team together. You want to train and practice it before you roll it out. You want to make sure you work out the kinks ahead of time instead of having to do it should an incident arise. You need to identify what you want to offer employees regarding leave, financial support, and all of that. You want to know if you have an EAP, how should they respond? Really important to remember that confidentiality is key. So you have to think about, does everyone need to know about this? Does the manager need to know? Maybe, maybe not. It will depend on the situation. You want to educate what domestic violence is to your employee base. And we'll talk about that more in a second here. You also want to integrate it with other policies. So it's not just a standalone policy. And you want to be prepared for reporting. So should someone come forward, you need to be prepared to follow it through from the beginning to the end. And then the 4th is employee education, as I mentioned a second ago. Bring advocates like Ashley and the folks from Hawk in to talk to your group. Make sure your employees understand what domestic violence is and what resources are available in your community. Use your resources in terms of spreading the word. We're obviously in October, which is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, but that doesn't mean that we only talk about it during October. This happens 365 days a year. So have digital materials. Maybe it's information on your paychecks. Posters we have found have been really valuable, especially if you put them in public places like restrooms and employee break rooms and places like that, not just outside the HR office. So if someone's going to look at that poster there, they, other people might be looking at that and wondering, oh, why are they looking at that poster there? Have handouts, use your e-newsletters and your printed newsletters if you still have them. Those are ways that are going to really help to separate your organization and show that you want to be an active leader in this issue. And if you do it, you're going to quote like this, which is, after getting help from my supervisor, I worked so hard. I think I gave back as much as I could to her. It gave me a sense of commitment to the work because they were there for me through the rough stuff. If you just stick it out, what a loyal employee you'll get in the end. Going back to what Julie was talking about, turnover. It's so much easier to do the right thing for an employee and help them out when they need that help than it is to start all over again.
And so in the next section, we're going to talk about some guidelines for coworkers. And so to start it off, you might say, why doesn't a victim or a survivor come forward? Well, some reasons we've already touched upon. They want to keep it confidential. They don't want to share this information because it's quite personal. They might have a fear of retaliation or being fired, and so they don't want to come forward. They might also be skeptical about how their employer would respond. And then in some cases, there may be some cultural barriers associated with coming forward. And so in situations like that, coworkers become quite critical. A coworker might say to themselves, I think one of my coworkers may be experiencing domestic violence. What should I do? And so coworker, as we described, sitting next to someone, working on the same project with someone over a long period of time, they might see that something is wrong. They might see that there's unexplained injuries. Oh, I fell down the stairs the other day. I just slipped carrying the groceries in, when that's really not the reason why they're injured. They may see their coworker be anxious or upset or depressed. They might also see someone that calls in sick a lot. And so they're frustrated that they're calling in sick all the time and they need to get something done together, or work problem. And so they're putting the pieces together. And so as a coworker, I suggest that they shouldn't ignore these signs. They should ask questions of the victim in a private place. I don't want a coworker to challenge or accuse or argue, but I want them to be a listener. I want them to expect that they might encounter someone that's fearful or mistrusts. I don't want them to be an expert, but there's some natural responses that might come along. We talked about this a little bit, but the victim may feel awkward, as well as the coworker. The coworker might say to themselves, I don't really want to be intrusive. I don't know what to say. And what if I'm wrong? What if I'm suggesting something that isn't happening at all? I do want you to remember that most battered women and men who are offered help, they deeply appreciate it. They might not even say so, but they genuinely appreciate that someone is coming forward and asking them if they're okay. Knowing people that are out there offering help makes it so much easier for a victim to take action. I'm going to reiterate, I don't want a coworker to be an expert. I don't want them to advise an employee. I don't want them to try to mediate with the abuser. I don't want them to make promises or discuss this with others, but I can give you some tangible ways that a coworker can help. They can listen without judging. They can let the survivor know that they care about him or her. They can make them know that they're not alone, that they've seen statistics and they know that others are going through something similar. One important piece of information is they can explain that domestic violence is a crime, as much as a crime as robbery or rape. And so if someone is robbed, they of course would seek help from the officials, the police. That kind of is a natural action. However, in domestic violence, often the abuser does not come forward relative to getting the authorities involved. A coworker can emphasize that when the survivor wants help, it's available. Saying something like, maybe today is not the day, but there'll be a day in the future when you do need help, and I'm here to help guide you to the right places to get the expert advice. And inform them that information is available, that they're not responsible for the abuse, that physical violence is never acceptable in a relationship, and that protection and resources is available to them. And so thinking it through, what do you do upon disclosure? And so from an employer's perspective, a coworker and or a victim comes forward to you as the employer, and they say, this is going on and I need some help. And so think about things that you would regularly do if you're conducting an investigation on something other than domestic violence. You would save threatening emails or text messages or voicemails. We talked about company equipment being used, and so you wouldn't save any information on a personal device, but oftentimes many forms of customer equipment is being used. You might involve security and review parking and escort options. Oftentimes I've found that simply moving someone to a parking space that's closer to the building and or in a lighted area on a regular basis is an easy accommodation and something an employer can do to help. You could relocate an employee's workspace. Now, I caution you here, whenever you're making any type of accommodation, whether it be for a physical disability or a non-physical disability, you always want to involve the employee in whatever the accommodation might be. So you as the employer might say, yeah, of course, we'll simply move your workspace. The employee might say, absolutely not. My abuser sits out, I sit by a window and my abuser parks outside and watches me do my work from the car through the window to make sure I'm at my desk and at the place where I say I am. And so if you were to move my space, then that would inflame the situation. It would make it worse for me. And so I give you that example because it seems like a reasonable accommodation from the employer's perspective, yet from the employee's perspective, it wouldn't work at all. You could, as a company, obtain a harassment prevention order. You probably have a no solicitation policy, or you might have a no trespassing policy, all depending on the business or the work that's being done at the business. You might need to think about a harassment prevention order. You may not, but it's an option. You might obtain a picture of the perpetrator and provide it to the reception area or to security so that should the perpetrator come into work or try to come into the building, that people at the front area are prepared. You might also identify an emergency contact person. Oftentimes employees have emergency contact information in an HR system, and the emergency contact person is in fact the abuser. And so an HR person can simply work with that employee to gain the name and information of someone other than the abuser to be able to contact in the situation of emergency. Some of these things are very easy to do, and some of these things are more complicated, but will always involve the employee when you're making accommodations. Employers make mistakes. We're not perfect either, you know, and we think we know what we're doing in these situations. And so here's some advice on some top mistakes that employers make.
Yeah, I'm gonna go through those, but before we do, I just wanted to stop for a second to see, do we have any comments or questions in the chat, or does anyone else have any comments or questions they want to add before we move forward?
Cindy typed in the chat, you know, some of these examples that you presented are definitely pertaining to some larger businesses, but what type of help and resources are available for small businesses that may not have an HR department?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where I think we go back to, you know your local domestic violence organization, your Jane Doe affiliate, which in this case would be Hawk for the North Shore. Know your local police department. Do things like this, you know, educate yourself on the issue and other issues, you know, because obviously there are a lot that companies have to deal with. So it's sometimes easier for larger companies because they have more resources. So smaller companies have to think about it a little differently.
Would also add that managers can do a lot of this as well. You know, an HR person might have experience in some of this more than a manager, but a manager can absolutely identify an emergency contact person and have that information at hand. Managers often know things are going on like coworkers do long before any other large, you know, legal or HR department. And so managers can get a picture of the perpetrator and make sure they know what the person looks like so that they are informed and ready. So some of these tips and tricks could also be executed by a manager.
Thank you.
Great. So as Julie said, we want to talk about some of the top mistakes employers make. Julie's been doing this for a long time and has had real life experience and knows how to avoid these mistakes, but people that haven't, had that experience might not. So the top mistake is assuming the role of an expert. You are not one. We are not one. I am not one. Julie is from an employer perspective, but that's where Hawk comes in. They are the experts in helping people in these situations from a life perspective. You can help them as the employer, but they need more than that in most cases. Fail to establish consistent protocols. Are you going to treat your vice president of sales differently than one of your customer service reps? You better not, because that's going to come back and that's going to be a huge mistake. If you disrespect any confidentiality concerns, you are no longer going to have people come forward. Fail to involve the victim in seeking the safety measures or planning. Julie talked about that. It's the whole concept of nothing about us without us. So you don't make decisions for that employee without bringing that employee in and making sure that they are the right decisions for them. Like she said, moving their location of where they sit seems logical, right? But for some reason, it might, blow up their situation. So you certainly don't want to do that. You don't want to advise or judge. You don't want to ignore any workplace safety concerns. So if, coworkers are coming to you and expressing their concerns, if you're seeing something as a manager, if you're ignoring those, that could turn into legal liability situations. And then fail to properly train. If you have not trained on the issue, you're not going to know how to handle it properly. Just something to remember, on average, it takes a woman 5 to 7 attempts at ending a relationship before she can stay away permanently. A lot of people think, why doesn't she just leave? It's not that easy. Don't judge them. You're not in their shoes. You don't know what their life is like and why they're staying in this relationship. So if there are survivors, there are abusers, right? If 1 in 3 women and 1 in 7 men have been or will be victims of domestic violence in a lifetime, there has to be a fairly equal number of abusers, right? So if you have survivors in your workplace, you have abusers in your workplace. So let's look into the mind of an abuser real quickly so you can think about it from that perspective. Why do they batter? They've never been held accountable for their actions. That's one of the reasons. They've learned to minimize, deny, blame, normalize. Oh, everyone, this happens in every relationship, or I'm only doing this because you made me do it. These, things that seem completely illogical to us are how they gain control. Promise, they promise that this is the last time, that it's never going to happen again. Or on the opposite end, threaten. If you tell anyone, next time is going to be a lot worse. And you'll see that the behavior escalates over time. Interesting that studies show that men who, as children, witnessed their parents' domestic violence were twice as likely to abuse their own wives than sons of nonviolent partners. So I say surprising, but then again, you hear about, kind of the cycle of abuse and the cycle of, what you have grown up in is what you know, and that's what you continue to do. Let's talk about some myths about abusers, that they're easy to identify, right? Unfortunately, they're not. You think that they're people with anger problems, but oftentimes they're not, because they learned how to manipulate, establish control, maintain that control, that they have lack of skills. Again, not true. They are often skillful communicators. They know how to resolve conflicts. They, again, are working the situation. You think that they might have low self-esteem, when in fact, studies show that that abuse is much more common in narcissists. And whether we like it or not, narcissists are generally quite successful. that they have mental health problems. And yes, this could be true, but instead of being, sent to a batterers program, they're getting other types of mental health, which is not helping them in this specific situation. And then expressing remorse means that they'll change when the reality is that they're expressing remorse because they've been caught. And the likelihood that they're going to change is pretty slim unless there's some intervention that takes place that's going to affect that change.
And so I just want to ground us in the fact that there are laws that may apply to domestic violence in the workplace. I realize that some of these laws impact or are available to larger employers than maybe smaller employers, but absolutely some of these apply to smaller employers. Unemployment, for example. Someone leaves a job as a result of domestic violence situation, unemployment would or may be applicable in that situation. There are state and federal anti-discrimination laws. Massachusetts has a Domestic Violence and Abusive Situation Leave Act. Hostile work environment and sexual discrimination isn't acceptable in any workplace, and so there are laws there that can help us navigate things like this. Americans with Disabilities Act or Family Medical Leave, again, smaller employers might struggle with providing out time or time off, but sometimes accommodations are simple schedule changes. I need to go see the prosecutor at 9 o'clock, but I'll be able to be in by 10. And so instead of being out for a whole day, an employee can oftentimes get an accommodation of an hour, even from a smaller employer. There's workers' compensation laws, and there's also general negligent claims. And so I want you to make sure that you understand that there's some things out there that can help. I learned something the other day and we talked about domestic violence being a criminal act. Strangulation, if someone is being strangled or attempted to be strangled, they're 500 times more likely to die as a result of domestic violence than if strangulation was not in the picture. And so, that grounds me in it definitely is a crime, and coworkers and managers and employers maybe could identify the fact that someone might have been attempted to be strangled.
Ashley raised her hand.
Yes.
Okay.
Really great. Add a bit about strangulation because I think it's such an important topic because, like you say, it's a life or death situation.
Yeah.
Often people will use the word choking as of strangulation, normalizing like, oh, they try to choke me. When choking is an accidental thing that gets in your throat, impeding to breathe. As of strangulating, even attempt to strangulate, it's not a thing because just putting the hands in the neck with the intention of depriving breathing is strangulation, and it is attempted murder. Like, I just want to just emphasize in how important it is about the subject of strangulation, because individuals that do that are extremely dangerous, and the person that is it's a big risk. So yeah, I just thought it would be.
Yes, thank you. Actually, that is great. I know you are the expert and we are not. And so thank you for the clarification and the education. You're right. Someone might say, I was being choked, and that's not really what's happening here.
Great. So as we're wrapping up here, I'm going to do a quick little pitch for Employers Against Domestic Violence. We would love to have all of you become members of our organization. We are a membership-based organization. What we do is train employees on this issue, just like we're doing today. We help employers assess their needs, doing things like policy development, reviewing their existing policies, providing best practices, that type of thing. We also provide resources through our website and our e-newsletter. And we keep our membership rates really low, from $50 for individuals and nonprofits to only $350 for organizations that have 500 employees or more. We think it's really important to keep our rates low because we want as many organizations as possible to, be involved in this issue and have the resources available to them.
We also, if anyone is a SHRM member,
Oh, yes.
we also have the ability to provide accreditation hours as a result of this training today. And so if anyone is a member of SHRM, then reach out to us and we'd be happy to help you navigate that code to get credit for those hours.
And this is some of our contact information, our website, our email, our LinkedIn, and our Facebook. And we're happy to take any questions that you might have. Again, we understand that many of the folks on today's call are smaller organizations. So it's a little different than when you're working with larger organizations, but victims of domestic violence are working in organizations of every size. So it's important for every organization to understand the issue.
Glennis asked if the slides would be sent to the participants. Is that something that we could arrange? We'll certainly share. We've recorded this seminar. We'll certainly post the seminar on our website and put it in our e-newsletter as well for other people to watch. But
Oh, great.
is that something that you could send us the slides and we
Sure.
can send it over to someone
Should we
like
send
Glennis?
them to Julie? And
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, perfect. Yep, absolutely. We'll do that right after we end here, and anyone that wants them, more than welcome to have them. And if you have any follow-up questions after today, just reach out. This info@eadvma.org goes right to me, or you can do david@eadvma.org. It's my direct email as well. So either will get to me and we'll get back to you as quickly as possible.
Are there any specific sectors or business industries that are more susceptible to having either abusers or victims?
A great question. Not that we've been able to determine, because it's such a broad issue, 1 in 3,
Sure.
1 in 7. We have not been able to distinguish any particular industries that are, it's more prevalent in. I'm sure it exists, probably just based on the number of women that tend to work in an organization
Sure.
versus men,
Right.
but nothing specific.
Okay.
What we have found is that if someone comes forward and you don't handle it properly, then no one else will come forward. That's probably true of a lot of situations. So being educated and taking the right steps helps others come forward, where so the stats might be skewed if you do it right versus you don't, because then you don't really have valid data.
Good point. Any other questions at all, or? Well, thank you all very much for taking the time on this very gloomy Monday morning, first thing in the morning. Hopefully it helped. Hopefully you took a nugget or two out of it. And again, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. And if you need Julie's contact, I'm happy to provide that as well.
Yep.
Great. Well, thank you
Great.
both for coming in and joining us this morning. Thanks to everybody on Zoom who jumped on. And again, if you need any questions or any follow-up information, you can reach out to us here at the chamber, or of course, EADV as well. So thank you
Great.
both.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Have a nice day.